Hello, friends. We are lighting the candle, A World That Works, and I am Bill Carell. I am joined by my two friends, Jan Jeremias and Ken Caputo, and we will be, for the next hour or so, talking about something and kind of maybe making some things up and possibly quoting some folks and all the rest of that, with the whole idea of to bring to us and to you, our listeners, empowerment. The whole idea that whatever level you're operating at the moment, there's always a choice for you to to be at a different level, which doesn't necessarily mean higher or lower. It could be a completely different plane of existence. So transformation is talked about an awful lot. We talk about it as well. And I think for today's conversation, I'd like to just kind of dive right in and talk about. There were two terms I think we discussed maybe at the beginning of the podcast that I think bear maybe taking another look at. And it's kind of an interesting thing that it came up for me in conversation with a couple of different people at different times over the last week. But were the notion of accountability and responsibility, and what that actually means. We'll look it up, but the idea is what does it mean for us personally? It's kind of fun, but almost everything we talk about comes back to being generated by or operated in by you and me personally. So, with that said, let me have my cohorts say hello and take a stab at the two words if they're interested in doing so. If not, give me a better word.
Sure. Uh, well, I guess so Jim Collins in Good to Great, he talks about window and mirror maturity. And he's speaking of it in terms of certain leaders, what he calls level five leaders. And he says what you notice with them is when things go well, they point out the window and they speak to the value of their team or maybe even luck or something like that. And when things go wrong, they talk about their own personal accountability and responsibility. And it's they look in the mirror first. And then he speaks to the other style of leadership where when things go wrong, it's everything outside of themselves that's to blame. They're pointing to circumstances, it's someone else's fault, someone's out to get them, whatever it is. And then when things go right, they paste their picture all over the magazine cover. They're congratulating themselves, taking in all that adoration. So and this was a business book, and he was saying that all of the most successful companies, this is a 30-year study of public companies, had a level five leader, at the helm. And most of them are not people you would even know. These aren't the Steve Jobs of the world. They are quietly confident and competent people who just do the work to help their team and their company be successful. So I guess long way around is, to me, I think the important thing is understanding your relationship to those words. And when you look in the mirror, do you apply them to yourselves, or are they things that are applied to you when you get caught, from something outside of yourself, and you're using it to deflect and justify and defend, that kind of thing?
Interesting. Thank you. And Jan, how about you?
I look at those two words and I didn't even think I didn't even think outside of myself. I automatically thought inside or working with me on my own level. And I guess that came to me a number of years ago when I realized that there were certain things in my life that were happening that I realized that I had to take responsibility for what was happening.
Sure.
And I think that comes with a certain level of maturity. And I use that with this transition of maybe when you're a kid, you think your parents are perfect, and then realizing they're not perfect, and you blame everything that happens in your life on them, and then realizing that they're just people and they did the best they could. And basically, you have to take responsibility for your life. And so and I remember the point at which I came to that, realize all the things that had happened and why they happened. And I really looked at it within myself. And so it was kind of like, I have to take responsibility for that. And I look at it accountability as we can hold ourselves to accountable for certain things. But I always think of accountability as being much more of a partnership with somebody, working with somebody. And let's say it is a coach of being, having an accountability partner. So you're responsible, but actually, I think there's a difference between kind of quietly going about it and having to actually work with somebody so that when you're not accountable, like they look at you and say, okay, well, you said you were going to do this and you didn't do it. Because I think it's very easy for us to kind of push it aside unless you're a certain type of individual. I think it's very easy for us to say, okay, well, I didn't have time, and to come up with the excuses of why we didn't do something when someone else is in the picture. You may do that, but they're going to look for you and call you on it. So that's the way I think of it.
Hmm. So it's kind of interesting because I actually spent 3 weekends really diving into the differences and the distinctions between responsibility and accountability. And everything that both of you are saying is absolutely correct and true. And there's a very interesting focus. One is future based. When you are responsible for something, whether or not it will occur, it will be you who will be responding at some point in the future. So that responsibility is something, as they say, that can never be delegated, right? The responsibility, you can actually work to cause something to happen. And if it doesn't happen, the responsibility rests with the person who's responsible. And so, at a fundamental level, it was kind of interesting because the dictionary that I found said it's a state of or fact of being responsible, answerable, or accountable for something within one's power, control, or management. Now, that's narrow, because what are parents responsible for? There's nothing narrow about their responsibility. It's called whatever happens, you got this. And using the word accountable to define responsible collapses for me what the power is in the two different words. So, for example, if we're talking about accountability, the state of being accountable, liable, or answerable. And, at a fundamental level, responding or accounting, those are two words that are, I think, what do they say? That a difference without a distinction for most people, or a distinction without a difference. I guess you can flip those around. And the whole idea is that being accountable is what you do about the past. When you are asked about something that occurred that you are responsible for, you now must give account for it. And that's the perfect way for the level 5 leader to behave. The first thing that I learned when I was around a man named Jack Welch one time, who happened to be one of those level 5 leaders who absolutely was famous. But the first thing that he said when he started the meeting, he said, I have a rule for you all to follow today. There will be no one at fault during the next 2 hours except for me. If I don't say a single word, anything that doesn't work in our conversation is my problem. You must agree to these terms in order to continue the meeting. And that broke everybody up. So he really didn't say anything else for the next 2 hours, but everybody kept glancing in his direction to find out whether or not the responsible and accountable person in the room was actually satisfied with the progress that was being made. So to kind of sum up, responsible is future based. These are like the concepts of where your responsibility lives. This is your agreement for what you'll be responsible for. This is your job description. And then accountability is when the responsible person is then asked afterwards, tell us what happened. How did it work out? What was good about it? What wasn't good about it? And the neat part of having a responsible person do that is there are always going to be a solution based account, or the responsibility is going to define how the accounting of what happened, is actually unfolded. Does that make sense? And that makes it a lot narrower than what we were talking about with the two definitions, uh, and very focused on performance, very focused on, um, if you start out and you're going into an unknown situation where most people find being responsible very difficult, you don't know that much about it. And that's the way it is in a lot of startup companies. And that's the way it is in a lot of situations where you're creating a sports team from a bunch of athletes or a bunch of, you know, athlete wannabes. So the neat part of it is what do you take away? What do I take away? And at the end of the day, it's not about making anybody bad and wrong. I guess a corollary to that is that a team always has all stars, 1 star all stars. It's not about, accentuating the behavior of the person who did the best job today and making everybody else feel like they were less than because they didn't produce the same result. And I think true leaders, and this goes for, captains of teams, people who are the informal leaders who quietly go about executing their job, and people look at them as the go-to person to get a job done. Like, we always had a guy on my football team. If we needed a blocker, it was his turn to be the pulling guard and get out there in front and knock somebody on their keister. And he always did it. Or he came back and said, I blew it. But it was not hidden from anybody that that was his job and his reason to be. So, where in our lives do we typically face responsibility and accountability? Is this typically found in most people's lives? Or are we in a time when mostly it seems like it's not present, at least as far as media and all that sort of thing is concerned?
I think it depends on your view and how you choose to live your life, doesn't it? I mean, you it's very easy to see areas where you feel like you have no responsibility because you have no control, and that vague they is out there manipulating everything and you're powerless to do something about it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So when if you're coming from that place, then you're gonna feel like you don't have any responsibility or accountability to it. Then on the flip side, you have like, I can manifest and just believe it all into being, and the quantum field will, you know, and that can be a little too far in the other direction. It's interesting. You ever hear a guy named Jocko Willink?
I haven't.
He's Navy SEAL, does ex-Navy SEAL, does a really cool leadership. He works mainly in corporate America. He wrote a book called Extreme Ownership, and it was basically about exactly that, taking complete ownership of everything. Um, and a couple years later, he basically came out and said, "I mistitled that book and I confuse people because they're not, you can't always own everything all the time. Other people also have their own responsibility and accountability, and that has to be factored in." So he wrote a follow-up book called The Dichotomy of Leadership, which spoke more to the reality of things are complex and they require oscillation between these two poles to achieve some semblance of impermanent balance. That was a lot of words. I don't know if that even just made sense with what I just said. But yeah, but so it's just kind of interesting how, I think that the challenge is, we talk a lot about self-awareness, but it's that awareness of yourself and your relationship to these things, and also awareness of your environment and the degree of influence you may have at that time, without relinquishing your service to those things. So I might get frustrated with the way the media portrays things, and I may not have a lot of direct control over that. However, I can take responsibility for what I feed my attention to. I can also take responsibility for how I respond to it. So if I'm echoing back, talking points or blasting, resharing and blasting angry memes on Facebook or whatever, you know, that's a way that I'm kind of relinquishing my responsibility that maybe I don't have to, and then I can sit back and say, hey, I'm just sharing it. I'm just saying it. I don't know if it's true, but I want my, I'm just saying, so there's no accountability there. I'm relinquishing that. So, so just kind of speaking to some of the relevant things that you see right now swirling around our world that lead to some of that chaos. And I think it's very, very challenging to maintain some semblance of clarity as to how these things are interweaving, you know, between ourselves on our own little island and our circles, and then the circles of those circles and outward and outward.
So, and I was looking at it, I guess I'm always the self person, and I was looking at it as what I feel that probably one of my biggest responsibilities is to my own health and to my own well-being. So, learned a long time ago that there was a lot out there I couldn't control as far as my health. Like, I mean, I go out and I walk and I can't necessarily, like, at that moment I can't, it's hard to it's hard to control the air pollution or whatever and all those kind of things. But I could control and take responsibility of what was in my own home. So I could take responsibility and say, okay, well, I'm going to look at my health and I'm going to look at the toxins I bring in my home. I'm going to look at all those environmental things, which I can, to the best of my ability, control in a situation or take responsibility for. So I think I love what Ken said, but I think I also feel that, especially when it's regard to health and wellness, I think that we need to take back some of that responsibility and not offer it out and just assume that other people are going to be responsible for us and our health. It's something that we have to be responsible for. It's our body.
There's a whole um, discussion of how people talk to each other. I mean, if you read through all the chapters and everything, the premise is that most human beings get all the social skills that they're ever really going to be uh, challenged with by and for by the time they're 12 years old. That when your personality has completed forming at the age of 12, you now can go through the rest of your life behaving that way in a different body from year to year. And that's the way most people actually interact with each other. And the reason for that is because they're always going to be um, not self-centered in a caring and loving way, but self-centered in a way where they are concerned about being injured, either psychologically or physically or some other way, or being diminished or dominated by somebody else. So a 12-year-old has a particular way of having a conversation with somebody. And when they're an 18-year-old and their voice changes a little bit and they're a little bit taller or a little bit whatever, what it comes down to, what happens if there's no adult in the room? What if everybody in the room is operating at the level they don't know they are, but there's no one challenging them, to like strike out, learn, grow, um, be accountable, and take responsibility, at least for their own social interactions and that sort of thing. So the interesting part of that for me is that the whole goal and the whole notion is that there's always someone in the room that is the adult in the room, and it's not the same person all the time on every subject. And when you were talking about Ken, that notion of impermanent balance, okay, that's where kind of social interactions go, where there are times when people get emotionally distraught and distracted from the words that are being said by their experience in the past of what those words mean to them, and they're not in the same conversation as the other person. So that's where the skill level, where people who are interested in becoming good social entrepreneurs, if you will, and the whole notion of being adept at building social capital and trust, as opposed to putting money in the bank, that kind of an entrepreneur. Um, the social capitalists are the folks who are really interested in raising everyone around them up, so that as you're doing that, there's training going on and people are actually being rewarded by having a different outlook on life. And I think that's why most of us read books, listen to folks who have a different metaphor or a different way of kind of talking about how do you behave in a group, and the whole leadership model. I never got any conversation through all my years of organized education. We never talked about being a leader. You either were natural born leader or you weren't. You know, I had to be almost 30 years old by the time somebody came and tapped me on the shoulder and said, you don't have to behave like that. I said, like what? Well, like you're behaving. Oh, thank you. Are you trying to piss me off? Yeah. Say something like that and then don't give me any more information, right? So I said, well, okay. I had no notion of a distinction of considering myself an actual adult other than by how many years I've been on the planet. So I thought that was fascinating. And when you get into those conversations where people are at the level of mastery in a different discipline, it could be health, it could be athletics, it could be any domain. Most of those folks are not interested in being the one who says the smartest things. They are interested in being around people who are asking better and different questions. And that to me is a fully functioning adult. It's like a possibility. Like and again, it's going to be these fleeting moments of impermanent balance where something actually happens and there's a reward for that. You actually get a sensation in your body, goosebumps, a shift in your solar plexus. It's kind of cool, but that's just me.
It's just so interesting how, like, I mean, think about it. Another good book is the guy that trained Michael Jordan. It's called Relentless. And then he wrote a follow-up called Winning. And he talks about the fact that Michael Jordan held himself to a standard that made other people uncomfortable. And actually, the term that was commonly referred to him when you played on the team with him was he's an asshole. And he demanded the most from you. So, and for some people, that's not someone they want to be around. They wouldn't want that person as a teammate. So, but does that make it wrong for Michael Jordan to be that way? If he was clear about who he was and how he chose to exceed and he exemplified that standard,
Yeah.
throughout his career. So it's such an interesting thing. And I've experienced this in athletics and in business, when some people get upset that you're willing to put in a 14-hour day, because then they feel like they have to do that. And when you're like, no one's asking you to, this is my personal choice. They're like, well, but I don't like the way it's making me feel that you're choosing to do that. Right. So it's challenging. And maybe on some level, there's some truth to that. So now you're trying to figure out the dynamic, so you have to kind of almost be able to separate what are my choices, what are their choices, how am I seeing this, how are they seeing this? Instead, what's most relevant to the dynamic between these two things interacting right now? Is that as healthy as possible? And even like self-care, there are times when I make a choice to not eat as well as I should, or give up a little bit of sleep in service to someone else or something else. And that's a personal choice. Like, I don't always choose to do the thing that's going to be best for my own health and well-being, especially when you're doing a startup. I mean, you just don't get as much sleep. It's just, so, and it's interesting. So, but in the back of your mind, you're like, you can't let that consume you. because now you're not going to be of help anymore. So there's this, this dance that you're doing.
Well, when you're saying that, Ken, I think about how often that I've been in that circumstance, not for, but for wellness, where I
Yeah.
will tend to be really good about what I eat, and it makes people feel uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Like when I go out and I choose, like I went to something when I went to the bar mitzvah last week, and I talked about last week. And first of all, I'm a vegetarian, and there wasn't there was like very little vegetarian food there. So that was one. And two was something, some other things. But, and I can tell, I go and I don't eat anything, and it makes people feel very uncomfortable. And I just, I know my body, and I know it's going to make me sick. I mean, it's not like I'm just doing it, it really is a self care thing. But I think people do not feel comfortable when sometimes they feel like you should be bad, quote unquote, sometimes. Like,
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's true. I've had that happen with alcohol, especially like the last year
yeah,
with the training I'm doing. I really love my recovery when I don't take in any alcohol. So I'll have the occasional beer, but it's very, very rare. And I don't drink sugary stuff. Like I don't drink soda or fruit juice. So I'm pretty
mhm,
much water and black coffee and green tea. That's like what and it's by choice. It's not, I have nothing against those other things.
me
Like
either.
you're saying, what I like. Yeah, but it's funny, like you realize how much alcohol is like part of the social experience, especially going out to dinner. And you do like I have friends that they just feel awkward, and it takes like some convincing. It's like, look, have a drink. It's I'm good with water. It's but I know what you're saying, because it is kind of interesting, that inadvertent tension that it creates.
Well,
And
I
I
can testify.
before Ken, because what he said, I wanted to make a comment because when he was talking about Michael Jordan and everything, is I also think it depends on the person's motivation for what they do.
Yeah.
Like, why are
Yeah.
they excelling? Like, is it because they want to stand out and be different, and they're trying to like make people feel uncomfortable because I think, or just like they're less than, or is it really truly because, whatever, it's for them to excel and whatever. So I think the motivation behind that matters when
No, that's a
someone,
good point, because Michael Jordan, it was to win championships. It's like,
mhm,
this is what it takes to win championships. But wouldn't it have been different if it was for him to get the most, like the highest contract? Like if it was about personal money being generated through his efforts, I bet you his teammates would view that a little differently, but his focus was intensely on what they all wanted: winning championships, period. So yeah, that's a really good point. The motivation does have a lot of influence on how you're going to interact with that.
There's another interesting corollary on two of your stories. The uh, Larry Bird and Michael Jordan, and then also Magic at some point. But
Mm.
Magic came along, at the end when Larry Bird and Magic were finishing their time. Michael Jordan was coming up. But the main thing to remember, though, is before Michael Jordan got to the Chicago Bulls, I don't think they'd won a championship in 15 years. I mean, they were perennially in the bottom half of at least in their division every single year. And they got used to that. And so, Michael's response to them and the other people around him for the rest of his life was the decision that he made, that no person was ever going to tell him that he couldn't do anything for the whole rest of his born days. Why is that? Because he tried out for basketball when he was in ninth grade and 10th grade, and they cut him from the team both years. You're a baseball player. Would you please just get out of my face? Plus, you're not all that tall. Well, how did he handle that? He grew 3.5 more inches, and he decided to dedicate himself to being a really, really good basketball player. So as he started getting to be better, and he started had a taste of winning. Of course, he was like a border collie running around, being in everybody's business, and telling them when they needed to pick it up. Now, Larry Bird was exactly the same, only different. Larry Bird inspired his teammates to never be the person that he was focusing his negative energy on. He always did that with the other team members. he always belittled the person that was guarding him. And there are so many stories about the first time so and so came on the court and then tried to stop Larry Bird. And Larry Bird, those people, his partners, his teammates would have died for him at any time in any place. Completely different, strategy. He just was this guy that you were never going to get the upper hand on ever. And Michael Jordan was the guy that you were never going to get the upper hand on because he had his team handled. So kind of a little different flavor of the same thing. But being from French Lick, I think Larry was just a different breed of cat all the way around. So the other thing that I was thinking about, Jan, when you talk about you go out to dinner and you're looking for vegan food and sometimes there is no vegan food, I can speak personally from how important it was for you to be honored, at a special meal that we went to together. And where I was coming from was I just wanted you to have a great time, you know? And whether or not you ate anything or I was willing to ask people to go to extraordinary lengths to take good care of you, but it wasn't like there was anything wrong in your choices, like I honored your choices. And now it's like, okay, now we know what the rules are. What can we do to really make, kick this up a notch for her?
Well, I mean, and I agree with Ken. I mean, I think it makes, because eating is very social. And and sometimes I debate. I'm like, do I go because I'm really not going to eat anything, or I can't eat anything, and then
Yeah.
what do I do? And sometimes I sit and weigh it. I'm like, depending on who I'm going out with, like, is it going to make them feel super uncomfortable? And so it's interesting. And then some people, it depends on their attitude, obviously, too, of how they look at it when that's happening. And that's really about them and not about me. But it is a dinner from, it is a meal, whatever that meal is. That doesn't only involve me and Tonka. So,
Well, if I have a vote on this, Jan, like the song says, if you get a choice to sit alone or dance, I hope you dance.
right, I agree.
You
But
know, and people will sort the feelings out afterwards, and you're just such a joy to be around anyway. It was like, it wouldn't have been the same without you, and I'm so glad that you came and joined us. Did you have a good time, and did you get enough food to satisfy you?
yeah, I had a great time. I had a great
I'll tell you, it's really interesting because I try not to eat any kind of like I still eat meat, but maybe once or twice a week. I'm mostly kind of plant-based and legumes and that kind of stuff. I'm not vegetarian. Um, but it's just dietary wise, I'm thinking about health and what works for me. So, but when you go out to restaurants, it's hard to everything is meat. Because it's like it's part of in our country anyway, it's part of the culture. And I had a really interesting experience at one point with a group that I went to dinner with who, eating meat was part of their identity. That meant you were an American. And they were very upset at the non-meat, like if there's an Impossible Burger or something like that, it's like, they're trying to take away our meat. It's like, and I'm always like, who's they and everything. But it's really interesting because they were complaining, not knowing that I had made a choice, to really reduce my meat consumption. And now I was faced with I'm thinking, all right, they're actually complaining about the thing on the menu that I was about to order. So so now what do I do? What do I do? Do I order it, anyway and accept the tension in this conversation? Do I just turn this into a meat day because I'm not that invested in it? So I'm okay with getting I don't do very much red meat, but I can get a chicken sandwich or whatever. I don't care. So, but it was fascinating how it was complicated, because and I had to think about if I introduce this level of tension, if I quote unquote take a stand or I call them out on their perspective, how is that going to influence the purpose of actually being here in this setting with this group of people who I had varying degrees of familiarity with right now? So there's a lot to think through. you know? And I was just thinking about how a lot of people wouldn't think through it at all. They would just have their reaction and then I don't know, maybe it would have turned into a food fight. I don't know, you know? So,
Well, as you said that, it reminded me of two stories. Well, first time when I went to Germany, in Germany at the time, I've been multiple times, but at the first time I went, there weren't a lot of vegetarians. Like vegetarianism was not big there. And I remember sitting down at a restaurant. I was being taken out to dinner by a whole bunch of colleagues who were from Germany, and I was a vegetarian, and I said I was vegetarian, and so they assumed that that meant I didn't eat beef. So then they turned to me and said, "Well, what about chicken?" And I
yeah.
said, "Yeah." Then they said, "Well, what about fish?" And I was like, "No." And they were like, looked at me like, "What do you eat?" Like
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
so not so foreign to them. But my favorite vegetarian was when I first became a vegetarian. I go to my grandmother's. She says to me, in all excitement, she says to me, "I made you chicken soup, but don't worry, I took out the chicken." And like afterwards. And I didn't have the heart to not eat it. I mean, she was so
Yeah.
excited, but it was really funny. But don't worry, I boiled it, but then I removed the chicken, so you're not going to get any chicken in there. It was
Well,
so
and that's a great example because you could have gotten all offended by her lack of understanding of what it actually meant to be vegetarian. But instead, you chose to approach that a little differently. Actually, it's funny in this circumstance, what I decided to do was I said to this guy, I said, "Hey, this is obviously something that you're very, passionate about. I was thinking about ordering the thing you're complaining about, but if it'll make you feel better, I'm happy to order a chicken sandwich." And he cracked up laughing. And he says, "Dude, order whatever you want."
cool.
And I
Or
said, "Well, I mean, it's just after what you just said, I just didn't want to create tension." And it ended up being a conversation,
yeah,
and he ended up being very intrigued by some of the plant-based choices because I was doing it mainly for athletic reasons and also some other kind of social reasons, just that so there are a lot of different things. And then he was explaining culturally why he was a meat eater and what that meant to him, and it just ended up being a very productive thing, like but it could have very easily, like if I had gotten all on a soapbox or something, that could have gone south really really quickly. So yeah, so it's funny how in that moment you made a choice, I think, that I would consider moving the social dynamic more towards balance, you know and instead of just unnecessarily unbalancing it. Sometimes you got to just take the stand too. I'm not saying you don't, but it's just kind of interesting thinking it through all the way, you know
well, what's really kind of interesting to me is like you're making a deal whether you should spend this relationship or not.
yeah,
We might
yeah.
never talk again,
Exactly.
but the funny part of it is we've all gone through periods of time. And when I first started doing the Atkins diet, or I was doing a keto eating plan or something of that nature, no bread, no cake, no pie, none of that sort of stuff, right? And I would constantly get asked, when I go over to a relative's house and say, "Okay, I made this really beautiful dessert. Are you going to have some?" And I'll go, "I'm really working hard to get my chest back up where it used to be. And would it break your heart if I don't do it right now and put it off until maybe after I'm done with this diet and what I'm working on?" And almost every single time, I just get a laugh back, and I go, "Now you don't have to bake a cake when you know I'm coming, right?"
Mhm.
Well, that's the funny thing too, because when there's trust in the relationship, like, with my inner circle, when we do things, they all tease me mercilessly if I like eat a cookie. They're like, "You're eating a cookie?" And it's like, because I just tend to not, and everybody's totally cool with that. And they know that. So, I'll laugh and I'll have a second cookie just to bust them back, because I'm okay with having the cookie. It's just, so it's interesting. But when you don't have that level of trust or familiarity, it makes it challenging to figure out how to navigate it sometimes.
Well, I know that like I'm planning, my have two really close friends, and um one of my friends is going to be 80, and so we want to take her out for her birthday. So my other friend, who we're taking her out, my other friend sent me the restaurant. Basically, there's not like one thing on the menu. So she looked at it and she said, "Well, what do you want to like?" We're going back and forth. I said, "Well, let me call the restaurant and just tell them." I'm a vegetarian. I'm pretty much a vegan. Can you make me something? I said, I'm fine with that. I don't care what anybody can eat. I'm never phased by what other people eat at the table. Like
Mhm.
that doesn't bother me at all. It's not like I can't go out with meat eaters or whatever. You do what you want, and I honor that. Just I'll do what I want and just
Mhm.
honor that. That's how I am. And so I'm like, I'll give if we decide to go there, I'll give the restaurant a call beforehand. I'll let them know when we're coming in, and I'll just ask them if they can prepare something. Because most of the time they will. Like they don't usually have an issue with it. And so that's the way I kind of have learned to navigate it. It's just that, and the fact that I'm really cool with it, with what everybody else doing, what makes them feel comfortable. Like I don't want I'm really, you want to eat meat, well, you can eat whatever you want. I don't necessarily like to talk about it a lot. Like, you know, I was like, my, but yeah,
Think about going out to dinner is supposed to be a social occasion, not a battle, right? So
exactly.
I mean, the other thing is I went out with a whole bunch of vegan people in New York City one time, and they took me to a place that had absolutely no protein other than plant-based protein on any of the menus. And so then I said, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, self-avowed meatitarian, right? And I broke them all up. And then I said, so you're going to order from me, and I'm going to hold you responsible for how
Mhm.
my meal goes, just to have fun, you know. And I said, all right, so you show me the ins and the outs. I mean, I don't care how much it costs. You get me the best vegan food that you possibly can in this meal, and I just want to really go that. Let's try it out. Let's see. I had a great meal. It was absolutely fabulous. It was nothing missing, and it was just like going and having foreign food or something. Like going and getting Indian food for the first time.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I
it's definitely helpful if people aren't if they haven't tied, those kind of personal choices into, some type of identity. Like there was an interesting article about a lot of outrage, I guess, because Cracker Barrel um, decided to add like a vegan sausage or something to their menu, and people were furious with that because that's I mean I don't know. I mean, I've been to Cracker Barrel a couple times, and it's definitely very like standard American. It's like fried on top of fried, then deep fried type. And there's
yeah,
yeah, so it's just, and they felt like this was an invasion of these I don't even know. I'm not sure what terms they were using, but they were very upset. It was like, I think it was like a political thing, like, these California liberal avocado eating whatever, that are now taking over Cracker Barrel. I'm thinking this is a business that's just thinking about a growing market, that they would want to attract to their restaurant. And not everybody wants to eat meat anymore as much. There's a lot of reasons for that,
yeah.
and so why not make their menu more inclusive? But for some people, that felt like an attack, you know? So, and, so that makes it very, very challenging. Now we're back to responsibility and accountability, and if you take responsibility for being understanding of other people's choices that may be different from yours, maybe that would, help things be a little less tense unnecessarily, so but I just found that really interesting because it just came across one of my health and nutrition feeds, and you had one group that was celebrating the fact that, hey, my grandparents love going to Cracker Barrel, and I never know what to eat when I go there, and now there's an option for me. And then other people who felt betrayed, but it's very polarizing in just a strange way.
Mhm.
So the other thing too, in full disclosure here, the Beyond type meats that are plant based, they're not vegan. Okay, they are
No.
they're actually like 30% higher calories than just a regular hamburger,
Mhm.
and they do use animal fat, to give it the flavor. So what was the reason for doing that? I mean, when it comes right down to it, to maybe a vegetarian is good with that, except for, there are people that aren't quite as, the line is right here, nothing having anything to do with a living, animal or that sort of thing. But I mean, not even clams, right?
Not me, but for me, I remember I had a girl living with me, a woman living with me for a while who actually worked for the one of the companies that was making one of the like a Beyond type burger or whatever. So I remember she brought it
Oh,
home.
I love both.
Yeah, she brought it home for me
Yep.
to try, and it wasn't like it wasn't the ingredient. I mean, not that because a lot of times a lot of foods like that will not have any nutritional value at all. Like it's all kind of like it's not necessarily healthy. They put a lot of stuff in it. But the other thing is, it looked so like meat that I couldn't eat it. It was like, I'm really sorry, but it's really, really not agreeing with me because like it looks like it oozes, like it looks like blood. I mean, I was like, no, I don't think so. Not in my radar anymore. At one point, maybe I would have, but I haven't eaten meat in so many years that I think that now it's just, the look, the smell kind of gets to me sometimes. So it's a little different these days than it was, when I first became a vegetarian, which was, I'm not going to age myself, a long time ago.
Well, what's interesting is, you also don't know where people's motivations are, So for some people, it's the treatment of the animals that's
Right.
led to that choice. So it has nothing to do with nutritional value. And, and if they feel that some kind of a meat alternative, you know, resolves that conflict for them, they
Right.
don't care if there's more fat in it or, so it's not relevant. So you don't know, we all always lacked context for the
Right.
deeper reason that someone's making choices. Sometimes they even lack the context for why they're making that choice. They're knowing themselves, but they're making the choice. So yeah, so it's really, again, now we're back to the complexity of being human.
And that and like I'm talking when I became a vegetarian, it was for different reasons than I am a vegetarian now. Like that
Mm,
changed. Not the actual becoming a vegetarian, but the actual reason or how like sort of it developed or evolved just like I evolved
yeah.
through time. So my original impetus for doing it is not what my impetus for doing it is. Are similar, but it's different now. So I think that changes sometimes too. Is why we got
Yeah,
into
yeah.
something, and then why we got into something isn't necessarily why we still do it.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. And there's nothing worse than a convert, right? Back in the early days when people were making the choice to go vegetarian, then they would have to talk about it and talk about it. And here's why I'm doing it. And the gophers in Africa and the wah, blah, 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 blah. It's like, I'm just trying to have some sushi over here. Is that okay?
Well, it's also funny how, the flip side to that. So 15 years ago, I stopped eating processed meat. And like, I haven't had a hot dog in 15 years. And it was because with all of my exercise and everything, my blood pressure was going up. And it, I, and of course, interestingly enough, my doctor was like, "Oh, it's probably genetic. I'll put you on blood pressure meds." I'm like, "No, can I try some dietary things first?" So I started looking at things like how much sodium. I just did some research on it, and there's a lot of sodium in processed meats, especially. I loved hot dogs, and I loved potato chips. So I just cut a bunch of that stuff out, and a year later my blood pressure had come back down and it's been perfect ever since. So, but what would happen was, especially those first couple of years, I'm at a cookout and someone offers me a hot dog and I say, no, thank you. And then they would challenge that. Why aren't you eating a hot dog? So now I have to give an explanation, and I'm not getting on a soapbox. I'm saying, well, because, there's a lot of sodium in them and it seems to affect my blood pressure. So I'm choosing that it's unhealthy for me. But then I had one person who heard it's unhealthy, not it's unhealthy for me. And now there's this whole thing, so I would imagine that people over time almost become programmed defensively to start proactively defending their position as to
That'll slow.
why they're that thing because it's different from the way everyone else is behaving.
Hmm.
So I talked to someone who was a recovering alcoholic, and he said it was so challenging going out and not ordering alcohol, and he always found himself fighting with should he say why he's not drinking alcohol, or should he just order, a soda or water? And it was very difficult for him because he never knew when someone else was going to question, even in a good natured way, his lifestyle choice, because it was different from their expectation and their understanding of the choices they're making for themselves. So again, it gets tangled. It's interesting.
It does get tangled because there's also sometimes things like, let's say you didn't want to share why you didn't want to have hot dogs. Like you didn't want to
Yeah.
share that personal health information that your blood pressure
Yeah.
was high, or that poor gentleman who was an alcoholic. Like that's not, there is that,
Yeah.
there is some taboo in our society about, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and not necessarily does everybody want to share those private details of their own life with people. And
Hmm.
then all of a sudden they're put into a situation where sometimes if you say for personal reasons, it just doesn't work. And I have a friend who always says this because she says most of the time people can't debate it. She'll just say it just doesn't feel right to me. Because she said nobody can deny you a feeling. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
what feelings you have is what feelings you have. And so she said, I just say it just doesn't feel right to me. And so
Yeah.
that's her like candid answer. But I think that, there is that element of privacy, like almost, that's my private information and I don't need to necessarily share with you why I don't want to have a hot dog or why I don't want to have a drink.
Yeah. No, and it's so interesting. I've seen it in fitness too, especially as I've gotten older. You get everything from the people who are like, yeah, anyone that doesn't work out like that throughout their whole life sucks. They're lazy, they're undisciplined. I'm like, well, I think that's a little, over the top. And then I have one friend who's like, I'm in shape. Round is a shape. And he's like, and he like takes pride in the fact that he has no desire to do any exercise whatsoever. And it's just, and it's just funny how, there's these, again, it comes back to identity. I mean, you got one person who their identity is linked to being disciplined and like tough or whatever by exercising, and someone else whose identity is, I don't need that, I'm above that, I'm just living my life now and enjoying my barbecue until, I have a heart attack, and he's cool with it. Like literally, those are not my words; those are his words. So, it's really interesting. I'm just reflecting as we're having this conversation about how people view this and the inadvertent kind of tension it creates with other people who just have chosen a different path, that they don't necessarily understand or agree with, you know. So
Hmm.
how do they handle it?
Yeah, the social contract, whenever the identity is brought up and my way is better than your way, this is a newbie. This is not a master. This is not somebody who has chosen this and quietly gone about the work, that he needs to do or she needs to do for themselves. And at the end of the day, they're not really even too concerned about what anybody else thinks about their lifestyle choice, nor would they even ask them to vote. So
Yeah.
the person who, like I said, the convert is the worst, because most of what they're saying is self-talk.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's funny, Bill. That's a really good point. I can remember when I started teaching martial arts for a living, one of the reasons I did it is I was very negative, and sort of overly aggressive person. I was very angry when I was younger. And so, like, for 5 years, if someone asked me how I was doing, the only thing I would say was awesome. And, and I was learning a lot about having a positive mental attitude, and I talked about it a lot. But you're right. I was not talking about it for the benefit of anyone other than myself, because I was trying to convince myself that as hard as it was really freaking hard. so so it's like I had to talk about it a lot to try to, seed it in myself. And eventually I was able to let that go and kind of relax about it. But yeah, that's a good point. From an outward, I know I annoyed people, and I know I did,
Yeah.
and they wanted me to say something other than awesome. It's like, you're allowed to have a bad day. And I'm like, yeah, but I can't speak to that. Not yet, you know? So yeah.
The funny part of all of it is you can walk through a room and listen to different conversations, and This isn't my idea, but I really subscribe to it. If somebody's making a statement, they're talking about themselves. If they're asking a question, they might remotely be interested in the other person.
Mm. Yeah.
But the statement is self-talk, and the question is, well, let's just test this out here for a second, see if there's anybody over there.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I'll tell you what, when you stop and think about all the things going on in the world right now, we don't have a lot of firsthand evidence for anything going wrong. You know what I mean? I have to go and talk to somebody who's talking to somebody who's listening to somebody to have any kind of a sense that this isn't the best the world's ever been and the best it may ever be, you know? Because the evidence that I got from the people around me and, my partner in life and all the rest of the good things that go on in the world, not too shabby.
Yeah. I think everyone has, there, I guess there's how much you're able to be in the present moment compared to experience anxiety of what may happen in the future, or sadness over what was, that you may remember as being better than what's current, you know and that's challenging. I think a lot lately about Viktor Frankl too, and him talking about the difference between liberty and freedom,
Yes.
and and saying that his captors had liberty, they could go where they want and do what they wanted, but he felt that he had more freedom, you know, than they did in many ways. And it was very interesting. I think those two things, those might be words worth having a conversation about,
Yes.
because I think there's a lot of confusion right now as to what freedom is as opposed to what liberties, you know, the ability to go where you want, do you want, versus truly being free, as in how you choose to react and respond to things that you may not have direct control over.
Yeah.
So
We're,
yeah,
we're
so I think that creates a lot of anxiety for people. It's hard to see the present moment as a gift, especially if it's kind of sucking, you know, and often the moment you're in sucks, you know. That's life. There is suffering, there's suffering and death.
Absolutely. You know, the liberty tends to be transactional. You need to be given the liberty by somebody else. Freedom,
Yeah,
don't worry about it. There's nobody who can stop me if they couldn't stop me if they tried.
And
yeah,
and to your point, Ken, when I think about being in the present moment, I always feel if you can find at least one thing to be grateful for. So gratitude to me is very linked to being in that present moment because most of the time you can find one thing or more to feel gratitude for. And it might be, the amazing blue sky or the look of a tree or, a kid's laugh or whatever.
yeah,
But, then I think it grounds you and brings you right into that present moment. It kind of reminds you a lot, even when you're having the worst day. And I'm not saying that day isn't, but it tends to at least give it a tinge more, I want to say, softness around whatever that anguish might be or that suffering might be. It
mm,
tends to bring a new element in.
yeah. I find it very encouraging that that's such a kind of a mainstream thing now. The idea of gratitude journals, and like that's something that I don't think you would have heard as much about the idea, you know, couple decades ago. So, in certain circles you would, but now it's very mainstream. I think that's kind of powerful, you know.
Yeah, I always laugh because when people ask me, I always say, you don't do a yoga teacher training or one of those meditation, anything like that with in my world without having some sort of like where you have to have a gratitude journal.
Oh yeah, yep.
To have a gratitude journal. And when I remember when I first took my first one, they were like, write down a list of things you're grateful for. And I remember sitting there and thinking to myself, like writing down three things and thinking to myself, oh my gosh, like that's all I can think of is three things to be grateful for. I felt like I was a gratitude failure. It was like there has to be more.
Well, it's an undeveloped muscle, for so many of us, and it's just really interesting how it's funny. We started in classes years ago. It was after I read a lot of Seligman's work on positive psychology. And we started putting this thing, we call it Five Things, One Challenge. And at the end of every class, we just kids can raise their hand, and adults too. Just, let's come up with 5 things that we enjoyed about the class or that we're grateful for. And then one challenge, one thing that was difficult for you that you're going to work to, continue to explore next time. And, there's always that ratio. And it'd be funny, like some classes, lots of hands would go up, and others, like it took someone, sometimes even the teacher, to offer something, and then the dam would burst. So it doesn't always just come to you. It's interesting how it does take a little bit of effort sometimes to look in that direction,
Right. I remember then I shifted it, and I used to think, I had a journal, and I would say I had to write down one thing every day, like, or
Mhm.
whatever. And I kept it going forever. And, it was different than having to come up with a list where I don't know. I think it
Yeah.
was, I'm a list person. I make lists. So I think, my lists are always very long. So I think just seeing two at the top always seemed, okay, there must be more. But having one thing, because I think it's also takes off the pressure. Most people can find one thing to feel
Yeah.
grateful for.
Yep.
So yeah, but it is funny.
Well, if you're ever the recipient of a phone a friend, there is one question that you can always ask to help somebody get out of a funk, and that's, tell me what you love about your life.
Mm.
What do you love about your life? Everybody has at least one thing, and you can't talk about what you love about your life and be in a funk. They're two different states of mind. Try it, you'll like it, and then you'll have
Well,
something to be grateful for.
it's interesting because it pulls you into the present moment,
Yes.
because and that's really what it's about. And it's just, I remember my teacher saying, really, like in his world, enlightenment was really just a proportion, the proportion amount of time that you spend present moment relative to future and past. And
Hmm.
it's just the more of your time that you're in the present moment, and the past and the future become kind of just waypoints, the more you move towards that state of quote unquote enlightenment. And I just found that kind of interesting as a simple way to think of what could be a very complex concept,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. What you pay attention to, you'll get more of,
Mm,
and
Hmm.
what you pay attention to tends to persist. So if you're paying attention to thoughts about the past or the future and not in the present, good luck with that. Because this is where all the goodies are. Even the
mhm.
good things that you are remembering or looking forward to, right now is the only time you ever get. This is it. There's only now. And I mean, that just like bends your mind to think about it. This is it. There's only now. It's a long now for many people, but it's now.
Yeah, it's always good to remember also, past teaches us that a stove that's on is hot, and the future teaches us that there could be a cliff in front of you that you could fall off of, you know. So it's like,
Oh,
it's so that you're not just wandering in this blissful state all the
it also
time.
teaches us some falsehoods too.
Yeah,
So let's be,
yeah, yeah.
anyhow. Any more thoughts to kind of wrap us up here?
I'm good. This one was fun.
Yeah, it was. I'm
So let's
trying to
try.
focus on our words.
I'm sorry, Jan. I was talking over you.
No, I said I was trying to think based on our words if there were any last thoughts, but go ahead.
Um, so I'll ask you both. What do you love about your life?
I love what I do. Yeah, I really do. I love I love being in service to people. Just
All of it, just
Yeah.
all of it. It's not always comfortable. It's not always, you know, enjoyable. There's definitely at times there is suffering that maybe lasts longer than is necessary, painful lessons that are learned, but I wouldn't, it's just all of it. It's the only one I got. I woke up this morning Like, I don't know. It seems like every year that's the thing. Just grateful when I wake up in the morning, and it's just, we'll see. And some days go better than others, but
Hmm.
that's all right.
I love that too. I love that I always have future conversations to look forward to while I am splashing around in the present.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, thank you again. And once again, we are lighting the candle, a world that works. And you let us know, are we getting it done? I mean, are you feeling any of this? Because I'm averaging 2 or 3 goosebumps a session, and I think that's not too shabby. Anyhow, we will be back at a future date for another recording, and thank you for listening wherever great podcasts are. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week, as well as the rest of the network, at xvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.